What a beautiful night. Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is Jim Ellis. I am the director of the Calgary Institute for the Humanities, and I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture by John Ralston Saul. This lecture has been organized by the Calgary Institute for the Humanities, which is Canada's oldest humanities institute, founded at the University of Calgary in 1976 to support high-level humanistic research and to promote the value of that research to the greater Calgary community. We are proud to have acted as a bridge between the university and the city for almost 50 years now, through over 40 annual community seminars, through our Calgary Atlas project that maps lesser-known histories of the city, through our public humanities program that places doctoral students in community organizations such as this to perform research, and finally through events like tonight's lecture. Before going further, however, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered here on the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, the Bearspaw, and the Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. Here at the Confluence Historic Site, we are really at the heart of Treaty 7, where the Bow River meets the Elbow, a traditional site for gathering, trading, and ceremony, known as Mohkinstsis to the Blackfoot, Wichispa to the Stoney Nakoda, and Gusitsi to the Tsuut'ina. I want to begin by thanking some of the people who made tonight's lecture free and possible. Major funding for this event was provided by the Applied Ethics Program at the Calgary Institute for the Humanities, which was established through the generosity of Rod and Betty Wade. The program exists to promote the public discussion of ethics, and we're very grateful to them for this and very happy to have them here with us tonight. Welcome, Rod and Betty. Support for Mr. Saul's visit was also provided by Libraries and Cultural Resources at the University of Calgary. And I'd like to extend a special welcome and thanks to Vice Provost Mary Jo Romaniuk, who leads Libraries and Cultural Resources, and who is also with us tonight. And thanks very much for her team for making all of the travel arrangements for Mr. Saul. John Ralston Saul has been for many years one of Canada's leading public intellectuals. He is perhaps best known internationally for his philosophical trilogy that started with Voltaire's Bastards, The Dictatorship of Reason in the West, to The Doubter's Companion, A Dictionary of Aggressive Common Sense, and finally, The Unconscious Civilization, books which have been widely translated and widely read. But he's also written a series of very important meditations on Canadian history and identity, with a particular and salutary emphasis on the role of First Nations in Canada. He's published acclaimed books such as Reflections of a Siamese Twin and A Fair Country, Telling Truths About Canada, the latter of which makes the argument that Canada is in fact a Métis nation, far more Aboriginal in its inspiration than European. This was later followed in 2015 by The Comeback, a book about the Indigenous resurgence in Canada. He's also written 6 novels, including the Field Trilogy, which explores some of the same themes as his more political and philosophical writings. From 2009 to 2015, John Ralston Saul was the president of PEN International, which advocates for the value of literature and freedom of expression, acting as a voice for writers and journalists who are harassed, imprisoned, or killed for their views. An issue that is sadly becoming more and more pressing these days. While president, Saul was particularly interested in drawing attention to the plight of endangered languages worldwide, and I'm happy to draw your attention to the important work undertaken for many years now in the linguistics department here at the University of Calgary in preserving the Blackfoot language. PEN's advocacy for the importance of creative expression has all of a sudden become more relevant here in Alberta, where the government has a newfound interest in the content of school libraries. An interest spurred on, according to the press, by a couple of advocacy groups who are actively hostile to the rights of LGBTQ people, and indeed to the rights of children, as laid out in the UN Charter on the Rights of the Child. The government's broad and hasty directive to public schools to remove all books with any sexual content made international headlines when a former president of the Canadian chapter of PEN, Margaret Atwood, responded to the banning of her own book, The Handmaid's Tale. Apparently, Atwood is back in, but the government is still after the LGBTQ content, so stay tuned for further developments. Tonight's lecture, Globalism is Dead, is something of an update, I suspect, on another important work of political philosophy of Mr. Saul's from 2005, The Collapse of Globalism and the Reinvention of the World. And it will be interesting to hear what has and what hasn't changed in the years since the publication of that book. But before I turn it over to him, I should say that John Ralston Saul has in fact a long history with Calgary. His family lived at Currie Barracks when his father was in the armed forces, when John was 6, and his first media mention, in fact, came when he wandered off on a cold winter day and was subsequently rescued. And he's been in the media ever since. In the 1970s, he was back in Calgary as the second employee of Petro-Canada after Maurice Strong, and he was the person who actually chose the building that Petro-Canada went into, which was named Red Square. While here, he taught a course on Québécois literature at the university, and among his 22 honorary degrees is the one he received from the University of Calgary in 2003. So I'm very delighted not really to welcome him here, but to welcome him back as one of our own. Please welcome John Ralston Saul.
I'm so glad you mentioned that business about my first mention on radio in Calgary. I remember it very clearly. I mean, it was a wonderful thing, and it was actually when I first learned about military strategy, because we were living in Currie Barracks in the middle of the country in those days, and it was in the middle of the winter, and it was very cold, and I had a sleigh, and someone who I think was 7 wanted my sleigh, and they were quite a bit bigger than me and threatened to do me harm, and I learned how to retreat. I ran away pretty quickly, and the trouble was at that age you don't know how to stop. I just kept going, and in those days that meant you just started going down a country road, and I have 2 memories of that. One was somehow in a snowsuit, which must have been one piece. I did manage to get it open to pee on a wonderful white bank of snow. I always remember that, my first memory of yellow and white, you know, sort of. And the second was that somewhere as the light was disappearing, and therefore my life, because I was in the country, a farm wife looking out her kitchen window, and I guess I'd been on the radio, saw this little boy wandering down the road out into the countryside, and she came out and offered me cookies, and I learned about bribery and how it can be good, and I went in and I was saved. So Calgary did play a big role in my early life, and of course Petro-Canada days were very exciting. The early ones in particular were very, very exciting, to put it mildly. And I'm glad that Jim mentioned the question of book banning, and I'd just say a few words on that topic, because as he said, I was president of PEN for 6 years, and you know, PEN's been around since 1921, 30,000 writers, over 100 countries, and what we do is we try to get writers out of prison, and we try to keep them alive, and we try to stop governments from torturing them, and we try to stop governments from banning books. And so for 6 years, I traveled at least 70% of the time to very difficult places, and somehow managed to get in almost to see the dictator. I usually went with the Secretary General, who was Japanese, and a wonderful American, and the 3 of us had learned how to become a smiling, terrifying group of people, and we would talk to them about freedom of expression and why really they should act better. But what you learned talking to these dictators and authoritarian figures and generals and police chiefs and so on, once it was actually a retired nun who was in the dictator of a Central American country. It was really the most interesting country, about ethics and why she wanted to keep people in prison. I mean, that was complicated. You know, God seemed to think she should keep people in prison. I don't know. And but what you really learned was the extent to which people who have power are always terrified of people who use uncontrolled language. By uncontrolled, I mean not controlled by them, not written down properly by them or by their people. And they're terrified of language. They feel its free speech is out of control, that anything can happen. And the result is that writers are the most persecuted people, most persecuted profession in the world. There are more writers in prison than any other profession in the world, more killed than any other profession in the world. And so, we would have these fascinating conversations, really, where you try to explain, you'd get a half an hour, maybe it turned into an hour if you were fun, and often they would say, my wife told me I had to see you. It was one of the most common lines, interestingly enough. And you would try to explain to them why they shouldn't torture, why they shouldn't imprison, why they should, dependent on the case. Maybe you could just get them to cut a year off the prison term, or maybe a bigger cell, or give the guy or the woman some medications, or better food, or more food, or family access. And of course, in the conversation, there was always, don't ban books. It doesn't do any good. People will always get the books, one way or the other, just as we all did, reading books under our covers at night when our parents thought we were asleep. I mean, take that to the international level. You can't ban books. It doesn't work. And it's really always amazes me that people who are supposed to be dealing with poverty and unemployment and growth and development of roads and communications, where do they find the time to worry about what books I'm reading? I mean, don't they have something better to do with their time? And as I say, it doesn't work anyway, because we'll get the books one way or another. One of the ways in places like Canada and the United States that governments try to stop books coming out is through people reading them, is through the libel laws. The libel laws in Canada are in general terrible, and they're basically written in such a way that if you're libeled, unless you are in a government department or in a big corporation, you can't possibly take on a fight, because it costs way too much to fight your way through the courts to win a libel case. And this is very common throughout North America, used by governments at all levels, and often by religious groups, I might add. And the other is the banning of books in schools, in libraries, in school libraries, and so on. Or, at worst, actually trying to stop people from publishing books. That also happens in subtle ways. And in the United States, that's happening quite a bit at the moment. So the other thing I wanted to say about it is that when you listen to what people say about why books should be banned, they always talk about it in moral terms. What if a child saw this? What if? Wouldn't it be terrible? My God, etc. Well, here's the thing. Freedom of expression has absolutely nothing to do with morality. Freedom of expression is not a moral issue. Freedom of expression is not a religious issue. If it were, we wouldn't have freedom of expression. The whole story of the rise of democracy is about removing our ability to speak freely from the control of organizations like aristocracies, religions, and governments. That's what charters of right are all about. It's not their decision, it's our decision to make. So freedom of expression exists at the foundations of democracy. The legitimacy of democracy lies with the citizens, with you and me. We represent the legitimacy of municipal and provincial and federal democracy, and we express our control, our representation of that legitimacy. Yes, we always talk about voting, but voting's the easy part. Going out and voting, that's the easiest part of being a citizen. The being involved, being committed, getting up and going out the door and being present on public issues, that's far more important. And being heard on public issues, not being afraid to be heard. So we have responsibilities as individual citizens, and we have rights. We always talk about our rights. We do have these rights, the Charter, but we have responsibilities which make the rights work. If we don't engage with our responsibilities as citizens, the rights are worth nothing. And the principal citizen responsibility, frankly, is to protect the rights of other citizens, because we have a job as individuals to work together with others. And those who try to prevent individuals from reading or writing or seeing images are actually betraying the role of the citizen. The Charter of Rights is clear about this. So to try to limit what people read, write, or see is a form of ideology. To try and limit or control what people read, write, or see is exactly like communism or fascism. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of people who think that that is a horrible comparison, but it's not. It's an exact comparison. I'm saying this as somebody who for 6 years went from country to country to country and talked to people who try to limit freedom of expression. I've thought a lot about it. I've talked to more people about it than probably 4 or 5 of us in the world who've talked to as many people about what freedom of expression is and how it works. And you know, if you try to limit, you're an ideologue. It's as simple as that. So here's the thing. I mean, democracy, and we have a pretty good democracy, is not a tidy system of life or of governance. It's really a mess. It's probably the least efficient form of government which exists. One thing about authoritarianism and utilitarianism is they always promise efficiency. They always promise they're going to deliver. I mean, that was the big Mussolinian argument. The trains would run on time. And we can make the trains run on time if we make a big effort. But it takes an enormous effort. You know, we've got to hire a lot of people to do it. And it's not proper to democracy that the trains will run on time. But if we can put the structures in place, we can make it happen. Whereas the utilitarian and authoritarian societies, making the trains run on time is the sign, in their minds, of the success of their society. Free expression takes an enormous amount of time. Debate takes an enormous amount of time. You've ruined your whole evening coming here. I mean, just think about it. I mean, all this time you're taking listening to me, and then there'll be questions and answers. You have to get here, you have to park, then you got to go home. Because what did you do? Words. My God. Well, it is an extremely time-consuming way of life, democracy. It's not utilitarian. It's not a natural system. It's not delivered to us by a deity. It is not the property of an elite, although in some cases, for example, ever since that decision by the American Supreme Court about funding for political parties, and one could say in the United States, it's increasingly becoming, their system of democracy is becoming less and less democratic because it's more and more in the control of those who have the most money. But the other side of it is that to be a citizen, we don't have to pass an IQ test. We don't have to own property. We don't have to have a certain level of education. There were times when a lot of that was the case, and we didn't get better government. That was what was so interesting, you know, when the elites ran it, or when you had to have a certain amount of property or income in order to vote. We didn't have better government. We've never had, frankly, such good governance as we have today, with everyone voting, whatever their attitudes, their lack of of education, or their high levels of education. And me with a PhD and 22, did you say, honorary degrees, I got one vote. So does an unemployed guy who didn't finish high school. And that's fabulous, because it really, really works. I'd hate to have Canada run by a bunch of people like me. You need the balance, which is the reality of society. So here's the thing. Democracy lives or dies on the willingness of you and me, the citizens, to engage, to give of our time. And if we're honest with ourselves, we have the time to engage. We have more time than we've ever had, most of us. Now, some of us just work all the time and we don't have the time, but those are the people who will engage, to be frank. But we have more and more time because a lot of jobs, thanks to technology, you could probably do a lot of the jobs in our society on 3 days a week or 2 days a week. because the technology can do it. We haven't faced that fact because the unions and so on are frightened of that, because if we said that without a prior renegotiation of how society works, we'd have a lot of very poor people. So if we're going to actually come to terms with the fact that we don't need to work as much, most people, then we have to redefine what it means to be a citizen in a democracy like Canada with all of these astonishing technological breakthroughs. Then we could have a 30-hour week, and maybe we would have more time off. But in my view, we should also be redefining the society where we would say, well, as a citizen, we can't force you to engage, but here's a list of 30 things, and you should be giving X hours a week to that. You should be engaging as a citizen. We always talk about volunteerism, but I'm not talking about volunteerism. I'm talking about citizen engagement, which is not paid, right? So it might look like volunteerism, but it's not exactly the same thing. And I think we have to sort of move away from this idea of volunteerism towards the idea of citizen engagement and how important that has to be in a society like ours. The administrative structures, which are so important in our country, whether it's in private industry or in our bureaucracies or in our unions, are sort of terrified by this conversation because they don't know what it would do to them. And in a way, the jobs which are the hardest to justify are the administrative jobs in the top half, right? If you're working on a line or you're working in a field or something, it's clear what you're doing. If you're one of 5,000 people administering something, it's not clear that you're one of the people whose job is absolutely necessary in the modern time. So we really have to think carefully how we go about all of this. We're faced with the need for an enormous turn in how we organize our lives, in terms of how we spend our time, how people spend their days and their weeks, in terms of their work, in terms of their leisure, and in terms of their commitment to their society. And Western society, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the end of the 18th century, we've gone through a series of these big changes. And every 20, 30 years, there's a gigantic breakthrough with some new form of technology, some big change in society. And when we refuse to be conscious of the change, then there's disorder. There's poverty. There are often revolutions. There are societies that break apart. But if we're intelligent, if we're conscious, and if we say to ourselves, look, there's a massive change going on, how are we going to handle this? What are we going to do about this? Shall we set up groups across the country and work out what the next 20 to 30 or 40 years are going to look like? That's what works. And we in Canada in the past have been pretty good at this from time to time. Sometimes we used royal commissions that actually would get us 30 years ahead because some really good people, like Gordon Commission and others, would go across the country and really talk to people, and they would come back and they'd say, here's things we can do, and we would do them. And we've lost the habit of doing that, of really figuring out what people think the next step should be. But there's no question that we're at a moment where we need to turn a big corner, and we need to do it so it doesn't turn into poverty and disorder. Now, when globalization, you were wondering when I was going to get there, right? When globalization came to us, sort of in the 70s and whatever, it was presented, I remember very clearly, it was presented as a great leap forward, if you'll excuse me quoting Mao to talk about globalization. But Mao would have understood globalization totally. It was an ideological proposal. And yet it was not a leap forward. Really, globalization was always about avoiding, delaying, talking about the implications of the big technological changes, which meant that we could change the way our society ran. People didn't want to talk about it, so we said, well, borders don't matter anymore. We're going to do everything big. Everything's going to go all over the world. And we sort of made it grandiose so that we wouldn't actually have to talk about how we were going to organize our societies. And in fact, one of the arguments of globalization was we don't need to talk about how we're going to organize our societies because thanks to globalization, national and regional democracies will no longer be relevant. because it's all going to be international. It's all going to crash across borders, and things are going to be so big and so powerful, and the world is going to change. Well, in fact, the world didn't change, and it was not powerful, and it wasn't particularly interesting, frankly. In fact, what happened was that we sort of stalled for about 40 years in many ways, not technologically, but socially we stalled, and standards of living stalled. And we hid it through changing the way in which we defined inflation. It's one of the problems today when people talk about inflation and you look at the numbers and they're still single digit. Whereas if you go back to the 70s, people got nervous when it was double digit. And I remember, I can't remember if it was France or England I was studying at the time. I think it may have been England under Mrs. Thatcher. I think they redefined inflation something like 14 times. In 12 years or something like that, because they didn't want to admit what was actually going on. And so we've ended up with a very poor sense of what inflation looks like and what real growth looks like and what stability actually looks like, that you could actually have stability which is not necessarily like 19th century growth. It might be a different kind of growth which involves people doing better in their societies, being more stable in their society, as opposed to the old idea, which was actually leaps of forward. So globalism brought us back to this old, really imperial shibboleth. It's a wonderful word, shibboleth. Look it up if you don't know it. That borders no longer mattered, that everything was going to be global. And it was really a reinvention of the old imperial empires, the British Empire, the French Empire. Borders didn't matter. Everything was going to be global, except we used to say, borders don't matter. It's the British Empire, unless you're in Paris. Borders don't matter. It's the French Empire, or the Italian, or the German. And the result of this sort of delusional period was that economics, which was always in Western civilization, not a great intellectual area unless it was economics put together with geography or with history or with political science. Then it was more interesting. But once it was all broken down into specializations, economics is really a technical skill and not top of the line. But with globalization, economics was promoted to the top because globalization required that economics be number one. And suddenly you had these people who were incredibly boring, I'm sorry if you're in the audience, were incredibly boring and really incomprehensible most of the time, who were telling us about things that were going to happen that usually did not happen, and things we had to do which were not doable. And the result of all of that was we went into decades of a crisis in governance, whether governments could work, a series of debt crises all around the Western world, which came out of nowhere. We all knew how to handle debt. There's a long history going back to Athens, thousands of years of how you handled public debt. I will simplify. Some of you know I've written about it. When it gets too big, there's 2 or 3 ways you could handle it. One of them is you rip it up. The other is you open a drawer in a desk and you have these beautiful debt papers and you put them in the desk and you close the drawer and lock it, and you open it 50 years later. There are a number of things like that. That's what we've always done. And suddenly, in this globalist period, we were expected to live day to day, living in fear of debt, of national debt, of provincial debt, of our own debt. Whereas in fact, civilization, Western civilization, was built on debt. The great breakthrough, the great breaking away from the church and from the aristocracy was the use of debt. That's what our civilization is based on, the glory of debt. That's what it's based on. Now, it can get way out of control, it'd be too much, and then it all falls apart, and a new group comes along and puts it back together again. That happens periodically. Usually there's a war or something along the way. But largely, debt is something that intelligent leaders in Western civilization work with. But globalization took us back into a bad period somewhere in the 19th century where we were supposed to be frightened of debt, unable to deal with it, counting every penny that we owed. Oh, our grandchildren. What about our grandchildren? Well, they're not going to have a problem. I mean, it's not going to be worth anything by then. And if it is, we'll just put it in a drawer. And I'm simplifying this on purpose, just so you, giggle or something. But anyway, one of the big outcomes of this confusing globalist period, which looked down upon the nation state and the citizen as the democratic guarantor of the nation state, was that citizens began to lose respect for the elected. Remember? We're just coming out of that now, just coming out of it. They started to lose respect for governments and government's ability to deliver programs. And then you began to see a drop in voter turnout. That didn't come from nowhere. That came out largely of globalization. And the next step out of all of that was, people were very dissatisfied and very unhappy, was you began to see from this argument of internationalism, which was false internationalism, you began to see a gradual return of the arguments of nationalism. Suddenly nationalism started popping up all over the place. And I wrote about this a long time ago, and I said, look, everybody's getting very excited for or against nationalism, but the reality is there's nothing wrong with nationalism. You have to think about nationalism. There are two kinds, really. I called it positive nationalism, which is citizens building their society, being engaged, believing in Alberta, believing in the foothills. I believe in the foothills. I think the foothills are the most beautiful thing in the world, probably, just in case you didn't know. And I hope they're not all built on. And I'll be going out tomorrow with my cousin, who's sitting right there, to have a look. So positive nationalism is a very wonderful thing. It's, being proud to be a Canadian and knowing that being a Canadian means that you must engage as a citizen. And then there's what I would call negative nationalism, which is not really caring about the good of the other, having all sorts of very exciting arguments about, well, we're the best country in the world, we're superior to the others, white people are superior, or, Anglicans are superior, I'm an Anglican, or whatever, and other people are inferior, all that kind of garbage, which was negative nationalism, racism, and led to the terrible, terrible violence not on the margins, within the Second World War. And that kind of negative nationalism led to all sorts of violence at different levels. It led in the last decade to the increase in the number of local wars, which we don't even talk about. If we actually, our newspapers and our televisions actually talked about all the wars, our news programs would be very long. We just talk about one or two wars in general. So people get used to talking about them. So it's as if now we're living in a return to the middle of the 19th century, where we're talking about these sort of local wars. There's more and more negative nationalism around, particularly in the United States, but of course that spreads all over the place. And you look in Europe, you look in Poland, you start going around Europe, you see all those things from the 1930s that were very frightening coming back in a big way across Europe. And you see it elsewhere in India. You see it all over the world. It's sort of pushing its head back up. One of the big figures in the middle of that sort of 19th century nationalist period was the Prime Minister Palmerston, who loved little British imperial wars, sending people out there to kill people who weren't white. And I won't use the language that they used at the top. And there was an American president, Grover Cleveland, who did 2 terms in the late 19th century, second half of the 19th century, who was a real kind of 19th century negative nationalist in that style. And in fact, he was the last president to openly and publicly and regularly covet Canada, to speak up about, we got that border's in the way, that border's a real problem. And he was the last American president to covet Canada until Donald Trump came along. I mention that because it tells you where we are. We're back at Grover Cleveland. That's where we are with Donald Trump. We're back with an American president who belongs somewhere in the middle of the 19th century. So, in the Western world, I think we can get out of the crisis that we're in, the collapse of globalism crisis, if we force ourselves to understand the story that I've been trying to tell, and if we try to understand the situation here in this country. I don't think it's surprising that Trump, president of our closest ally, I never use the word friend, I don't think countries have friends, our closest ally, our closest neighbor, our biggest neighbor. I don't think it's surprising that Trump turned on Canada. It's a serious threat by a president who instinctively, I don't think, he's not an intellectual, but he instinctively identifies with those large pieces of US history which involve geographical expansion. And you know, US history is about geographical expansion largely. And if you go back and look at the way the history developed, it was always assumed from the 18th century on that the United States would be all of North America. And when you talk carefully to American leaders, civil servants, generals, you'll find that about a third of them believe that the United States is America, a term which I don't use if I can avoid it, meaning North America. And that it's, you know, as long as they can control Canada, oil and gas, minerals, Northwest Passage, then it's not that big a problem. But there is an increasing number who actually are in the Grover Cleveland, Donald Trump school, who think that the border's in the way and something has to be done about changing things so that the geography can take on its natural, total form. One of the reasons that Donald Trump gets on so well with Putin is that they're very, very similar. I won't talk about it today, but I spend a lot of time. Putin came to power in the late autumn of '99, and my wife became Governor General at the same time, approximately. And during the next 6 years, we spent a surprising amount of time with Putin. I mean, when I look back on it, it's really quite amazing. He didn't really know how he was going to run Russia. He had ideas. He was quite nervous. And we were the people, in a way, that for several years he saw the most in the West. So that when we went to international ceremonies and things, when he saw we were there, he was quite relieved, and he'd always come over and we'd chat and all the rest of it. And it was quite bizarre. And he was really a lot of fun in those days. I'm not saying he was really fun. I don't know what he really was, because he's a KGB guy. But you had a lot of fun with it. And that's another speech. It's a long speech, and I could give it, but I won't give it tonight. But they get on together because I think Putin is a negative populist, like Trump. I think they both suffer from the same kind of inferiority complex. I'm sure you would agree that Donald Trump suffers deeply from an inferiority complex. Well, I can tell you that I think the same about Vladimir Putin. And they have the same concept of geographical expansion. In other words, not ships, not airplanes, but you just move the geography out. And that's important for Canadians to understand. In a sense, we're like the delicious meat in the middle of a sandwich, with Russia being the top bit of bread and the United States being the bottom bit of the bread. And it's a very awkward position. We've always been in this position, but it's suddenly becoming problematic and troublesome. The biggest risk for us, I think we all know this, lies in the north. I think, and we're already starting to do it, I think the government's moving. We have to move very, very fast militarily in the north. We're expanding the Rangers. We have to do a great deal in the north. And it's not just about doing the odd exercise. We have to have bases in many places. I've spent a lot of time in the north. We have to have bases all over the place. We have to have ships permanently there, not once in a while. It's going to cost a lot of money. But if we don't do that, if we don't make that major military and civil investment in the north, which the South has never been willing to do, because we look after ourselves, we don't really care about the north except for 6 months here and there. If we don't do it, we're going to wake up one morning and hear that the American Navy has put down an anchor somewhere off the northern coast of Canada and landed and put up some tents. And they'll say, oh, we thought we'd better do it because the Chinese ships were coming through. Or so. It won't sound aggressive. It'll be the beginning of the removal of our north. And I would say within the next 5 to 10 years, that could very, very easily happen. So we need to be spending an enormous amount of money, and the civil investments, The Inuit leaders have been talking a lot about this. The civil investments are very, very important. So, what I'm describing is a post-globalist world, dangerous, violent. I know, because I'm part Albertan, that many Albertans have identified over the years with the United States in a very personal way, something to do in part with the oil and gas business. I remember all of that when I was living here 50 years ago, second time, I should say. Well, all I could say is too bad. This is a new era. We are in a new era. And the United States, our southern neighbor, is on a long-term, probably intractable return to a 19th century style of imagining themselves. And in my view, it will be less and less democratic. I think we will see a gradual shrinking. They already have a fragile democracy. I think it will become increasingly fragile, particularly if Mr. Trump and his friends hold on to power. They will solve their growing internal problems, and God knows they have enormous problems of racial difference, of poverty, of enormous differences of opinion between right and left, and impossible to find ways to talk to each other. Remember, there was an attempted coup d'etat in Washington a couple of years ago by the current government of the United States. It was an attempted coup d'etat, violent, people died. And they don't like using those terms, so we're very nice we don't use those terms. That's what it was. If it was in Germany, if it was in France, if it was in Russia, we would have said there was a violent attempted coup d'etat in Germany this week. But because it's in the United States, we're not allowed to say it. Well, I'm sorry. That's what it was. And they will, as I've said, increasingly try to solve their problems internally through expansion and international strength, violence. This is a classic way for countries to distract attention from their internal problems of poverty, education, health, and a growing, essentially, civil war. Disagreement so strong that you can start to call it a civil war. You distract attention by doing something outside your country with your neighbor. We're the neighbor. We're the neighbor. They've already gone to Mexico City with their army several times, and I'm very glad to see that our Prime Minister and the President of Mexico are talking, because we need to be talking very seriously, not through the United States, with Mexico. But this is the reality of what lies, I think, ahead. We need to counterbalance. The United States is still going to be our big market, but it's going to be in constant crisis. It's going to be moving towards this internal civil something, war, disassociation, I don't know. We need to work very hard to counterbalance our dependence on the United States very fast. We need to shift our emphasis to the extent that we can to the rest of the world. We need to rethink our education, which has been so focused on the United States to a great extent, our postgraduate education, our attitude towards languages, our attitude towards cultures, our attitude towards investments. All of this, we have to shift rapidly towards other parts of the world. And I can tell you, for those of you who did French immersion has already paid off in many, many ways. But the kids who did French immersion and were serious often then did Spanish. And these kids have a real role to play. I see them all the time in Ottawa at assistant deputy minister levels and things like that, and ambassadors and number twos in embassies. These kids have a real, well, they're not kids anymore, they're 50 or whatever. They have a real role to play in what Canada needs to do now in the private sector and in the public sector. So there's going to be a lot of negative nationalism around us. We have to remain very calm and very determined and hold on to our positive nationalism, our attitudes towards public programs. We must not be bullied by propagandists into thinking that there's something wrong with public health care, there's something wrong with the strength of government, because look at the United States. Look at the disaster these areas are in the United States. Look at what happened to them during COVID versus us. Look, compare the numbers per capita. You'll see what the difference in the systems is. So we need to maintain these attitudes. We need to build up serious allies and partnerships elsewhere. I think that this is very exciting for Canadians who want to move beyond the old narrow north-south line. Very exciting. If I were in my 20s, this is just a fabulous moment to be a young Canadian and say, wow, we're going to turn to something really complicated, multilingual, multicultural. We can do this. We can go anywhere in the world. We can make Canada count in the world. Canadians used to think like that before the Second World War and just after the Second World War. And it was only after '88 that we started thinking that we couldn't do those kinds of things. The time has come really for us to embrace the country by embracing the rest of the world. Thank you very much. Thank you.